Yo, it's currency theory. Let's just get right to it. Now, to project World War III, we're not going to look at current events. We're going to look at historical precedent. Because the same entity that was behind the first two world wars, and many other major wars around the world for that matter, is the same entity that is in control today. And this entity is, of course, the tax demand driven monetary monopoly, which is embodied by the central banking empire. And if you don't understand the global control of the central banking empire, you should probably go watch my documentary, Chronicles of Today's Monetary Empire, a reinterpretation of money, history, and economics, here on my YouTube channel. Really, if we think about how the monetary system works, it becomes apparent that the central banking empire has even more control now than it did when it funded the past two world wars into fruition. Because the central banking empire has continued compounding interest until the debt overwhelms the money supply, which then creates massive defaults across the entire economy. Then the central banks collect the collateral, continuing to grow their control over the economy and its resources. Then the central bankers buy everything up after prices have crashed, continuing still to further their control over the economy and its resources. And then they start compounding interest again. And this has been going on for centuries, since their inception in 1694, through their expansion to covering the globe, through both world wars, and to today. So their control over the economy and the global resources is only more complete now than it was when they were funding both sides of World War I and World War II. So first, we're going to look at World War II, focusing mostly on the Western financial backing of the German side first, and that will naturally integrate some of the story of the rise of Communist Russia. Then we'll track backwards to World War I, which will also touch on some of the rise of Communist Russia. I don't want to start with World War I because it could give the wrong impression. Then we'll round out the Western bankers' support for Communist Russia, and by then, the banking network behind both sides of both wars should begin to emerge pretty clearly, and we'll be able to follow their operations in other parts of the globe and timeline to help us project forward the banking empire's plans and intentions for World War III. A small part of World War II was covered in my documentary, Chronicles of Today's Monetary Empire, a reinterpretation of money, history, and economics, so we'll play a clip from that first before diving deeper into World War II. So here we go with the clip. Brown Brothers Harriman and Company was shown to be a stockholder at the New York Fed in 2020. This is quite interesting, since William Averill Harriman, the original founder of Harriman Brothers and Company, and a key figure at Brown Brothers Harriman, had many of his business's assets frozen for funding the German war effort during World War II. Much of this funding was funneled through the Union Banking Corporation, which was a joint venture with Morgan Guaranty Trust, now known as Chase Bank. From Union Banking Corporation to a man named Fritz Thyssen, a wealthy German industrialist and banker, and finally, the German dictator, whose name I don't want to use because I'm not sure if it could be an excuse for certain platforms to remove this content. Thyssen, one of Germany's dictator's biggest supporters, detailed this funding in his book called I Paid, insert Germany's dictator's last name here. But William Averill Harriman's support for the German war effort didn't stop him from supporting the USSR in their war effort as well. Before the war, William Harriman, through his corporation, Georgian Manganese Company, revitalized the Russian export economy following its collapse after the Bolshevik Revolution. His dealings were technically illegal, and while the State Department and Department of Commerce were both informed of these illegal deals, neither of them decided to pursue this investigation. Officials at the State Department ultimately decided that, quote, there are certain and very definite reasons why I consider it very unwise for the department to initiate any investigation with respect to the reported manganese concession. End quote. Any further discussion on the reasoning behind this was to be discussed orally as stated in the same document. Then, during the war, while Harriman's bank was funding the Germans, Harriman was appointed the Lend-Lease administrator for the Lend-Lease program, which was created during World War II for the purpose of allowing the United States to lend or lease war supplies to nations deemed vital to its defense. Harriman was appointed administrator a few months before the Germans invaded the Soviets. And while the Lend-Lease program only specified that defense articles be shipped, records show that quite a bit of agricultural equipment and quite a bit of non-military industrial equipment was sent to the Soviets through the Lend-Lease program. Also interesting is Prescott Sheldon Bush's partnership at this company. Prescott was President George Bush's father. Other American banks who supported the German war effort in World War II include J.P. Morgan, Chase, National City, and Bankers Trust, all of whom were also stockholders at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. J.P. Morgan and Chase kept their Paris branches open during German occupation and were described by German authorities as holding a privileged position due to their cooperation. A partial investigation was opened into this business activity by the U.S. Treasury Department, but was never fully pursued. The accusations and statements made by Treasury officials and their suggestion for full investigation were shocking. A 1999 French government commission found that 5 American banks, Chase, J.P. Morgan, Guarantee Trust, National City Bank of New York, and Bankers Trust, looted Jewish accounts and turned funds over to Nazi authorities. Chase wired $25 million to the German government 6 months before the Poland invasion, well after Germany's Czech occupation, and well into Germany's anti-Jewish and Aryanization policies. Dollars were crucial for the import of materials like rubber, oil, and metal. According to declassified FBI records, Chase's involvement helped Germany import $197 million worth of American goods in 1939, including oil, copper, and aluminum. Chase's Paris branch chief, Carlos Niederman, wrote to Manhattan headquarters that the bank enjoyed very special esteem among Nazi officials and was experiencing rapid expansion of deposits under German occupation. Another key Western German financial partnership behind the Germans' World War II effort was the Bank of International Settlements, or BIS. Founded in 1930, the BIS originally sold stocks to central banks and commercial banks. J.P. Morgan and Company, National City Bank of New York, and National City Bank of Chicago combined bought about 1/10 of the BIS shares and continued accumulating more shares after that. Eventually, these shares were transferred to the Federal Reserve. Reichsbank, the German central bank, headed by Hjalmar Schacht, bought the same amount of shares in the BIS. Schacht played a crucial role in the founding of the BIS. He was also a close friend of Montagu Norman, who was a director of the Bank of England and a founding architect of the BIS. The Bank of England bought the same amount of shares as the Reichsbank and the American banks and was privately owned at the time. Norman was even a godfather to one of Schacht's children. Norman, his father, and grandfather were partners at Brown and Shipley and worked at Brown Brothers, which were both founded by Alexander Brown, who in turn held stock in the Second Central Bank of the United States, was instrumental in said central bank's implementation, and even served as a director at the Baltimore branch of the U.S. Central Bank. Eventually, in a merger, Brown Brothers would become Brown Brothers Harriman. So how did the BIS support the German war effort? Well, the BIS facilitated the transfer of 23.1 metric tons of Czech gold from accounts in London to the Reichsbank, despite the obvious coercion involved. The BIS also helped Germany convert the looted gold into Swiss francs and US dollars, which were used to buy oil, rubber, and metals, all essential for German rearmament. The BIS also laundered Nazi gold by accepting gold from the Reichsbank, much of which was looted from occupied countries and Holocaust victims. As an international and neutral organization, the BIS acted as a safe haven and clearinghouse for German funds at the height of World War II. And as an international organization, its assets couldn't be seized. The president of the BIS from 1940 to 1946 was Thomas McKittrick. After the war, from 1946 to 1954, Thomas McKittrick became the VP of Chase National Bank. Another interesting story about Western support for Nazi Germany is Henry Ford. Ford's assembly line was innovated in the same month the Fed was established. The Fed was buying commercial paper back then, as it does now. Here's what Ford had to say about America's monetary system. Henry Ford is even widely attributed with the following quote, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." End quote. Henry Ford would receive a Nazi medal in 1938. In December 1922, the New York Times, along with newspapers in Germany, reported Ford had supported Hitler financially. Ford's subsidiary in Germany, Ford Work AG, was being used by the Wehrmacht, aka German military forces, to produce war materials. This operation extended the full length of World War II. Paul Warburg, who we'll get further into for World War I, and Edsel Ford were both directors at IG Farben Industry, which donated a nice sum to Hitler's 1933 election campaign. They were not tried for war crimes in Nuremberg like many other IG Farben Industries directors. Now, as for World War I, another example of a single entity involved with a central banking empire that financed both sides of a world war is the Warburgs in World War I. M.M. Warburg and Company held stock in the German central bank, Reichsbank. While Max Warburg remained a partner at M.M. Warburg and Company, along with his brothers Fritz and Felix, and was a prominent financier of the German war effort, Paul Warburg left M.M. Warburg and focused his efforts more on his partnership with Kuhn Loeb and Company, which in turn, through the various commercial banks that Kuhn Loeb and Company held equity in, controlled a significant portion of stock in the Federal Reserve. Paul Warburg was also instrumental in the establishment of the Federal Reserve and served as the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve during World War I. While Paul was at the Federal Reserve played a crucial role in supporting the war effort for the Allies. The Federal Reserve began financially supporting the Allied war effort as soon as the war broke out in 1914, well before the United States entered the war officially in 1917. However, Kuhn Loeb and Company claimed to have a neutral stance. But early on in the war, Kuhn Loeb and Company did provide a loan to Central Power, Austria-Hungary, and by the end of the war, Kuhn Loeb and Company was making loans to the Allied nation Russia and helped underwrite loans to other Allied nations. Partners at Kuhn Loeb and Company were also acting in their own individual agency. Otto H. Kahn, for example, generously supported the Allied war effort. Another partner at Kuhn Loeb and Company, Jacob Schiff, supported the Russian provisional government that overthrew the Tsar until the Bolsheviks took it over. However, Schiff also tried to get National City Bank to finance the German war effort, even threatening to close his account with him. Schiff decided it was too risky, though, when National City Bank asked that Kuhn Loeb and Company guarantee the loan. Schiff also tried to convince President Woodrow Wilson to impose an embargo on all munitions to belligerent nations, which would have affected the Allied nations much more than the Central Powers at that time. Interesting side note, after the Bolshevik Revolution and Schiff's withdrawal of support, Max Warburg helped secure financing for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Felix Warburg was a partner at both M.M. Warburg and Company and Kuhn Loeb and Company for the majority of the war. Back to Schiff. Interestingly, the Schiff family held close ties with the Rothschild family. Schiff's father was a broker for the Rothschilds, and the Schiff family lived with the Rothschild family in the same house, known as the House of the Green Shield, for multiple generations. Schiff had two brothers, Philip and Ludwig, All we know about them is they were bankers at Frankfurt on Main, which is kind of like the Wall Street of Germany, and that they had retired by the time Jacob died in 1920. As for the Rothschilds, two brothers, one in France and the other in Britain, were financing the Allied war efforts, while another brother in Vienna was financing the Central Powers war efforts. All brothers most likely held stock in their respective country's central bank, or were partnered at a bank that held stock in their respective country's central bank, thereby giving them a degree of control over the nation's money supply and the issuance of new currency, enabling them to fund the war efforts. And they weren't just funding both sides of the war during World War I, but of course they were also funding both sides of the well-known arms race leading into World War I. Now, what's the incentive for this? Well, for one, nothing indebts a nation faster than a war, and the central banking empire needs to control governments in order to maintain their monopoly. And indebting governments and their currency that the population is accustomed to using is how central banks control governments. And if you don't know that, my documentary will prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And nothing indebts all the governments of the world faster than a world war. And the governments are already the central banking empire's biggest debtors. But what's more is governments of the world today subdue the population, which allows the central banking empire to continue operating its monopoly, especially since the government is the one who enforces taxes on bartering and private currencies, and then governments demand that the taxes on bartering and private currencies be paid in the national currency, which is supplied by the central banking empire, thereby creating a tax demand driven monetary monopoly manifested as the central banking empire. So really, central banks are a fascist establishment because they are the result of the cooperation of government and big banks, especially the Federal Reserve, who's at the helm of the central banking empire. But I always like to note that in the hierarchy, the central banking empire ranks above the governments, because the governments are in perpetual debt to the central banks. Once again, this is proven in the aforementioned documentary. So, from an organizational standpoint, the central banking empire is running the show. And another incentive the central banking empire has to manifest these world wars is that they lead to a consolidation of power in the governments. We saw each world war lead to an excuse or justification for new global governing bodies, such as the League of Nations in World War I and the UN and NATO in World War II. And by consolidating the tax demand driven monetary monopoly's governmental arm, the monetary monopoly can improve its dexterity globally, making the global population and the global economy easier to control. Another incentive is the consolidation of purchasing power. After World War I and II, we saw a consolidation of purchasing power into fewer Western currencies, where the central banking empire was already dominating. Especially after World War II, and especially into the dollar, where at the Bretton Woods Conference, global powers decided to make the dollar the world reserve currency. We'll cover that topic a little more later on in the video. So those are the incentives. So now, how does everything we talked about lead into World War III? Well, we already showed a little bit of how central banker capital flooded into what would eventually form a superpowered national rival to existing Western powers. We saw central banker Max Warburg's capital building up communist Russia, and we saw how central banker William Averill Harriman's resources helped revitalize the collapsed communist Russian economy. International Barnsdall Corporation, largely owned by central bankers like Guarantee Trust, later known as JP Morgan Chase, and also owned largely by William Averill Harriman, also helped revitalize the collapsed Russian economy after the communist takeover. And we know Guarantee Trust held a significant portion of the Federal Reserve stock. Prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, we saw many more firms controlled by, or deeply tied to, the Federal Reserve funnel money to the Bolshevik revolutionaries. For example, Federal Reserve stockholders, including National City Bank, JP Morgan and Company, Guarantee Trust, Grace National Bank, Chase National Bank, and Bankers Trust, along with Otto H. Kahn from Kuhn Loeb and Company, organized and controlled a holding company called American International Corporation, who played a huge role in supporting the Bolsheviks before and after the revolution. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, American International Corporation helped coordinate discrete financing from central bank stockholders like Guarantee Trust, National City, and Kuhn Loeb to the Bolsheviks, and advocated for pro Bolshevik policy with powerful Western politicians. After the revolution, they helped broker deals and secure financing from corporations like Ford, GE, and Albert Kahn Inc. to help industrialize the Bolshevik economy. And for years after the revolution and years after World War I, American International Corporation helped supply military industrial equipment, military infrastructure, and military expertise. Another pre revolution example is when once again Guarantee Trust funded Bolshevik banker Olaf Ashberg, who then funneled those funds to Bolshevik revolutionaries. After the revolution, Max May, vice president of Guarantee Trust, became a director of the foreign department at Ruscom Bank, which was the first international bank in the Soviet Union and where Olaf Ashberg became the director. Guarantee Trust became the U.S. agent for Ruscom Bank, facilitating financial operations abroad. Guarantee Trust also backed the Soviet Bureau in New York. Interestingly, Guarantee Trust was also a founder of United Americans, an anti Soviet organization that promoted Red Scare propaganda. But I digress. William Boyce Thompson, stockholder at Guarantee Trust and director at the New York Federal Reserve, donated $1 million of his own money to the Bolsheviks, financed, published, and distributed pro Bolshevik literature, and successfully advocated for pro Bolshevik policy with powerful Western politicians. Interesting side note, Thompson's deputy, Raymond Robbins, helped support the Spartacist uprising in Germany, which helped progress Germany on its path to National Socialism. Of course, these actions were part of a progression towards World War II. Now, I could continue on with examples involving Communist Russia, but that seems unnecessary when we know that communism cannot sustain itself. That's Econ 101. The people in a communist society have very little to no incentive to work, produce, innovate, or invent because they do not get to keep what they earn. How does a nation with an economy that has 13 million people, a significant percent of their population, starve to death in just a few decades, according to the most conservative estimates, also thrive in such a militaristic manner as they did without outside help from a freer society, or at least help from the robber barons of the freer society, stealing from the freer population to support the otherwise unfeasible and preposterous economic system that is communism? You could point to droughts, but starving to death in the West was rare even during the Dust Bowl, which was in the middle of the Great Depression. Communism was largely to blame. Of course, famine under totalitarian regimes such as communism is nothing new. Just look at the Great Chinese Famine under the CCP. And speaking of the CCP, we saw funds and resources flow from the central banker built communist Russia into the CCP and their revolutionary cause, which would ultimately prove successful. The Soviets supported the First United Front's revolution before that, in 1927, then also the CCP revolution after the CCP and KMT split and the CCP overthrew the KMT. Long before the series of Chinese revolutions, the central banking empire began infiltrating the Chinese markets by exploiting the subsidization of opium by China's state run medical operation. China had banned opium's recreational use, which counterintuitively led to a large surge in opium recreational use. And a quick side note here, and another point for free markets, metadata suggests that nationwide bans on narcotics do tend to lead to increases in the same narcotics use in that nation. The exceptions to what the metadata indicates to generally be true have involved authoritarian crackdowns, and even the success of those can apparently be short lived. I hypothesize that the hidden use of the narcotics that criminalization causes creates a lack of awareness in regards to the effects of those narcotics until the effects are too widespread to not see. Whether or not my hypothesis is true, it's nice to see that there's consequences for telling people what they can and can't put into their own bodies, even if it's considered to be for their own good. Telling people what they can and can't put into their own bodies is dictatorial, self righteous, and non consensual. But I digress. The only law we really care about on this channel is the law that is the linchpin of the totalitarian tiptoe, which is taxes on bartering and private currencies. Check out my documentary where I prove so to be true. If you disagree, please. Now back to Opium Wars. Bank of England stockholders like Palmer, Rothschild, and Baring, along with English immigrants in America, John Jacob Astor and Alexander Brown, who were stockholders of the Second National Bank of the United States, which was America's central bank at the time, were all major players, if not crucial players, in the Chinese opium trade that got funneled through the Chinese state run opium operations and smuggled to recreational users. This supposedly exacerbated the opium problem in China. Historical accounts indicate local authorities were also paid to turn a blind eye, and the opium ban was sparsely enforced. Shortly after China got serious about its ban of opium use and confiscated and destroyed British opium, tensions escalated. This led to the First Opium War, in which British naval forces quickly subdued Chinese forces. As a result of the British victory, the Qing Empire of China submitted to the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking established an economic environment in China where companies and banks from the Western powers, such as the US, France, and especially Britain, had more freedom from Chinese regulations than their Chinese competitors, who were still subject to the same regulations. This led to the expansion of British banking within China, along with American banks and other Western banks, especially of which were tied to central banking, or banks that otherwise issued tax demand currency. Tax demand currency is a term that I came up with that refers to a currency that is accepted for payments of taxes, even when there is no other use for said currency, such as bartering. In other words, a currency or other form of monetary product that is monopolized via tax demand of bartering and private currencies. You can learn more about tax demand currency in my documentary. But I came up with the term because there is no other term that highlights this facet of the current monetary market. Eventually, China pushed back on the Treaty of Nanking, which led Britain to engage China in the Second Opium War, which in turn led to treaties that favored foreign commerce and foreign banking in China even more. These extraterritorial treaties caused further expansion of Western banks and the central banking empire's influence in China. These banks began to gain control over Chinese foreign currency exchange, remittances, and indemnities. These banks gained market share within mainland China as well. The Western banks were probably the most powerful entities and ultimate decision makers in China, especially when we consider that the Bankster Empire was already the most powerful entity in the West, since it had been compounding interest into the world's largest economies for well over a century at this point in time. The power of the Western banks almost certainly transcended that of the Chinese government and the Chinese banks. Just look at the military and naval forces that the Western banks were the financing behind. The extraterritorial advantages given to foreign nations in China lasted until the 1940s. Major Western banks were able to ramp up their operations in China, which included making markets for the Chinese government debt, issuing their own banknotes, and even started taking major market share of bank deposits, since the Chinese government could not confiscate what was in these foreign banks. The aforementioned banknotes were typically convertible for silver, which had tax demand in China at the time, as well as many other countries globally. Of course, these banks were leveraging their silver reserves, meaning that they were issuing more banknotes than they had silver to convert them to, as is typical banking practice. So these Western banks were able to take advantage of a heavily centralized and therefore oppressive economic policy set by the Chinese government. With the immense capital these Western banks were able to generate by compounding interest into less centralized and freer economies, which then enabled these Western banks to start taking control of the Chinese economy as well. Of course, neither economy had achieved freedom in the monetary market, which is the root of the problem we're discussing here. Now, the story in China doesn't end there. A few decades after the Opium War and its subsequent treaties, in 1894, banks such as HSBC, Baring Brothers and Company, the French Bank of Indochina, which the French called Banque de l'Indochine, National City Bank, Rothschild banking houses in Britain, France, and Germany, and Deutsche, the Asiatic branch, all of whom are tied to their home country's central bank, most of whom are deeply tied to their home country's central bank, helped finance Japan during the Sino-Japanese War, while also financing China during the same war. It's also worth noting that many of the same bankers also supported Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, which played a significant role in the eventual downfall of the Tsarist Empire and the Bolshevik Revolution. Many of these same banks were prominent in the modernization of Japan before the war as well. Japan had set up its central bank in 1882. But let's not go down another rabbit hole in this video. Japan's defeat of China in the Sino-Japanese War further weakened the Chinese government and led to more concessions in China to the Western powers and Japan. The sense of oppression felt by the Chinese from Western and foreign influence, along with the weakened Chinese government, would eventually lead to the Boxer Rebellion. The rebellion engaged the foreigners from the West and threatened Western influence. So the Western powers, along with Japan and Russia, stomped out the rebellion and then forced the Chinese government to pay for the damage, leaving the Chinese government nearly broke and even more dependent on Western banks' financing in order to repay their debts. And once again, on top of the borrowing from Western banks China had to do to pay the reparations from the Boxer Rebellion, these Western banks handled the Chinese indemnity payments. Interestingly, these reparations paid in the Sino-Japanese War and Boxer Rebellion were paid in silver. Before the Opium Wars, trade deficits in Britain to China had led to an outflow of silver from Britain to China, which was a reason for Britain to start exporting opium into China. All this conflict helped build up to the 1911 revolution and overthrow of the Qing dynasty. The final straw in 1911 was when a major railroads construction project, funded by basically the same Western bankers, caused further borrowing of the Chinese government from Western banks, tried to screw over the public Chinese investors by only partially compensating them with government bonds instead of giving them full payment in silver, forced the Chinese taxpayers to back the railway loan payments to the Western banks with their own revenues, and also tried to reform the Chinese monetary system in a way that would have removed China's local currencies altogether. After the 1911 revolution and overthrow of the Qing dynasty, for the next few decades, Western banks that held the central bank of their home country's stocks continued to gain prominence in China. It wasn't until after a few years after the 1927 revolution, heavily supported by the central banker built Soviet Union, the revolution which enabled the KMT to set up a central bank in China, that the Western banks' influence in mainland China started to wane. However, the Western currencies issued by the central banks that these Western banks owned gained a huge portion of the global trade settlement market share from China's currency, the yuan. This expanded the Western currency's global dominance and purchasing power. Perhaps that wasn't good enough, though, because basically the same set of banks did the same thing in the Second Sino-Japanese War, providing financing to both countries involved in the engagement. The war lasted from 1937 to 1945. Although many of these banks basically had to bail in Japan halfway through World War II, this second war with Japan greatly weakened the KMT and enabled the 1949 CCP Revolution, which again was greatly supported by the central banker built Soviet Union, and which led to a new CCP controlled central bank and a brand new Chinese currency, the renminbi. Only after this did the Western banking influence in mainland China crash. However, because this new Chinese currency was not globally accepted, but the CCP still needed to pay many of China's pre 1949 revolution debts. So, through various cross border financial channels controlled by the same Western banks, renminbis were exchanged for dollars, pounds, or francs to pay off the Chinese debt, and to capture the value of Chinese trade surpluses, giving the dollar, pound, and franc an increase in global market share. The supply of renminbis in exchange for the Western currencies demanded gave the Western currencies dominance over the renminbi. Of course, these Western banks controlled the central banks that were issuing these currencies. And now, the currencies they controlled had greater global market share and therefore purchasing power. Well worth the trade off of losing business in mainland China. This CCP renminbi event happened 5 years after Bretton Woods made the dollar the world reserve currency. So, really, the lion's share of the market share lost by China's national currency went to the US dollar. Now, to give a little more historical context of what we just discussed, I'm going to play a few minutes of clips for my documentary. Since 1694, these profit generating central banks have been an ever expanding enterprise. To show this, I've created a visual of a world map that shows when each country established a tax demand issuing central bank that was or would eventually become the sole issuer of tax demand currency in that country. Yellow represents the country has a central bank established. The visualization starts in 1693 and progresses through the years until the current times. Note that this map is not compatible with the data for the countries of Somaliland or Kosovo. These countries are very small. Also note, this map does not adjust country borders for their time. Both of these issues are minor enough to not drastically change the overall pattern. Notice how the expansion starts off slow, struggles in some countries, then slowly gains a foothold, and finally starts to expand exponentially until it has covered the globe. So, what about backing the dollar by gold or some other commodity? Well, this is a huge topic that deserves a digressionary interlude from the chapter's stated purpose. So, prepare yourself for a long side tangent, please, and thank you. So, now let's discuss gold backing and the gold standard. The last time the US was on the gold standard was from 1900 to 1933. In the year that the Fed was established, in 1913, the Treasury transferred $143 million worth of gold to the Federal Reserve, about 7.5% of the Treasury's holdings at the time. At the same time, the dollar became a Federal Reserve credit note, so all of the newly issued dollars, which were now being supplied by the Federal Reserve Bank, were being lent, and therefore were owed back to the Fed plus interest. These same dollars were good in exchange for gold, too. I hope you see where I'm going with this. They were buying government debt that was good for gold with dollars they were printing. The Fed was compounding interest into the Treasury's supply of gold. And by 1932, the Fed had $3.5 billion worth of the Treasury's gold on its balance sheet, which at that point in time in history was about 83% of the Treasury's gold. Then, in 1933, the U.S. government ordered the confiscation of nearly all of their citizens' gold in exchange for dollars. Individuals had to turn nearly all of their gold coins in to the Federal Reserve in exchange for dollars. At the same time, the U.S. came off the gold standard, so dollars were no longer good in exchange for a fixed amount of gold, and gold lost all of its tax demand. At this same point in time, the Federal Reserve exchanged the gold it had for Treasury debt denominated in dollars. This fits a recurring phenomenon which is of big banks, including central banks, exchanging gold for more control over the tax demand currency, essentially exchanging gold for tax demand. So we see that the last time we were on the gold standard, it did not stop the tax demand driven monetary monopoly from supplying 100% of the new money by lending it with interest. And what else would you expect from a monopoly? As shown in the most recent implementation of the gold standard just discussed, known formally as the International Gold Standard, we essentially saw it used as a gold heist. Now let's dive deeper into the International Gold Standard because it fits into an interesting pattern pertaining to the consolidation of the current central banking empire. Countries kind of came onto the international gold standard in a staggering fashion and came off in a staggering fashion. But basically, the international gold standard was in effect from the late 1800s into the 1930s, when almost every central bank of the world's major economies was on the gold standard at the same time. Interestingly, the international gold standard was in existence at a point in time when many of the world's central banks were still privately owned. Then, most of these countries' central banks that were on the gold standard came off of the gold standard in the early 1930s and then became government owned banks in the 1940s. This departure from private ownership interestingly began happening right at about the same time as an event known as Bretton Woods. At Bretton Woods, the Allied countries of World War II set a new global monetary standard, which made the Federal Reserve's dollar the world reserve currency. This is interesting because not only was the Federal Reserve at the helm of the world's largest economy, the United States economy, but it is also one of the few central banks still privately owned today. The world reserve status essentially made the United States dollar the primary medium of exchange for all other fiat currencies. In other words, if the Bank of England were to trade with Japan, then instead of buying the Japanese yen with the Bank of England's pound, the Bank of England would buy the yen with the US dollar. So the Bank of England would need to buy plenty of US dollars with the pound, driving the demand for dollars while supplying the pound to do so. This gives the dollar a huge advantage over the other fiat currencies around the globe. Virtually all of the countries accepted this policy. In return, the United States agreed to make the dollar exchangeable for a fixed amount of gold to the other central banks. The Bretton Woods Agreement did not extend to private individuals, as only other central banks could exchange dollars for gold. The U.S. ended this agreement in 1971, despite that the U.S. dollar is still the world reserve currency. Now, within the central banking empire's expansion, the central banks appear to have siphoned gold out of the market into their own hands during the international gold standard, and only after the gold supply was completely controlled by the central banks did they relinquish their private ownership. And also, this relinquishment of private ownership of central banks in most countries came only after the central banking empire had consolidated its purchasing power into the dollar, which is issued by the Fed, which is still privately owned. You see how that played out? The privately owned monetary empire, known as central banks, expanded until they covered the globe. Then, once the empire had covered all of the world's major economies, the process of consolidating global purchasing power really gained traction, including the gold heist. So there's an observable pattern of more and more global purchasing power being consolidated into fewer and fewer private hands over time. This pattern is enabled by taxes on bartering and private currencies. Taxes on bartering and private currencies make would-be competitive private currencies inviable, thus creating a monetary monopoly. The details of how the market would work if there wasn't taxes on bartering and private currencies is in the last 40 minutes or so of my video, Chronicles of Today's Monetary Empire. But basically, it would enable free market competition from privately issued vouchers backed by businesses, goods, and services, probably predominantly commodities. This would create an environment where the national currency is accepted virtually everywhere, and certain businesses offer additional options, either their own voucher and or other companies' vouchers who they're already doing business with, opening up a new capital market to businesses, while forcing the value and purchasing power of the national currency to be reflective of the merit of government, causing any poor decisions made by the government to result in a sell-off of the national currency into private currencies, thereby taking away the purchasing power that would have enabled them to make such a poor decision. And no, this doesn't necessarily mean anarchy, because the need for government would coincide with demand for the national currency, thereby giving the government necessary purchasing power when needed. What a great investment opportunity untaxed private vouchers would provide, especially on a local community scale. Taxes on bartering and private currencies may seem like an insignificant detail, but it's not. The monetary market is good in exchange for the rest of the wealth. It's like the other half of the economy. Being half of the economy makes it the largest market in the economy. And taxes on bartering and private currencies monopolizes it, thereby monopolizing half of the economy. And because a monetary monopoly, including the one in existence today, creates a shortage in the monetary supply by only lending the money with interest, the compounding interest enables it to sprawl, generating its dominance and oppressive force into other markets. On the flip side of that coin, relieving taxes on bartering and private currencies would generate freedom into all other markets. Now let's look at how China fits into the global pattern. The tax demand driven monetary monopoly embodied by the central banking empire, which was mostly established in the West at the time, took actions that created conflict in China, which then led to financial issues in China, which then led to China's dependence on said monetary empire, which then caused more conflict within China and a vicious death spiral until a revolution enabled a central bank to be established in China. But a central bank still wasn't enough, because the Western bankers wanted to consolidate the global market share of the monetary market into their own prized currency. So they took actions that enabled another revolution that essentially toppled China's old currency, which gave the Western currencies, mostly the dollar, more global dominance. Over time, the CCP has loosened foreign and domestic economic restrictions, enabling economic growth, which in turn has given China's central bank, known as the People's Bank of China, and its renminbi, power. This has enabled the renminbi to start taking global market share from the dollar. But this loosening of restrictions that led to the renminbi's increasing purchasing power and subsequent global market share has also enabled the Western banksters to reintegrate into mainland China. A lot of this economic liberalization by China has to do with global trade. This global trade liberalization is largely due to lobbying from the same dominant Western banks and their influence on the World Trade Organization. And when Xi Jinping came into office, he opened Chinese government debt to be held by foreign investors. Before Xi, virtually no Chinese government debt was held by foreign investors. Keep this in mind after we deep dive on Putin here in a moment. Now, big Fed stockholders such as Citi underwrite the foreign sold Chinese debt. Chinese banks do not underwrite the foreign sold Chinese debt. As the Chinese government's foreign debt expands, the renminbi gains market share globally. But now, the renminbi's demand is dependent on international financiers and the same Western banks behind the central banking empire. Now, this reintegration into mainland China has largely involved Western banks providing capital to multinational Chinese corporations, which points back to the topic of this video. This gives the central banking empire's current mainstay, the Federal Reserve, or really, the banks behind the Federal Reserve, a degree of control over the development of the military industrial complex in China, at the expense of a waning dollar's market share. However, because the dollar's global market share and purchasing power still far exceed America's share of true wealth globally, Americans can afford, with our vastly overpowered currency, to import all sorts of goods from other countries without producing our fair share to export. Meanwhile, the central banker built, oppressive Chinese economy and government can abuse its citizens and labor markets to a large degree and does so even given the loosening of economic restrictions in China over time. So it makes sense now for U.S. corporations to outsource their production to China, taking advantage of the abusive labor market. This turns much of the Chinese citizenry into something like slaves to the U.S. citizens, reducing the need for American production, while also integrating U.S. tech into China and giving Chinese powers a first-hand look at the production of a lot of advanced U.S. tech. Meanwhile, Americans with his invisible slave labor and excessive purchasing power are greatly rewarded for their innovation and ingenuity, which greatly incentivizes and fosters such. To further this point, the conditions, the world reserve status the dollar creates for Americans, along with a high degree of relative economic freedom, also greatly fosters technological innovation. It's almost like the central banking empire is building a military-industrial complex by turning the United States into the R&D department and turning China into the manufacturing plant, making both countries part of the same military-industrial complex so they can send them to war against each other, where they'll be nearly equally matched. The power almost seems to have shifted in favor of China over the US, with all kinds of anecdotes of Chinese tech surpassing US tech. Whether or not these anecdotes provide an accurate picture of the situation, rationale tells me China is at the very least a threat to Western powers. Yet at no point in time does it seem like the central banking empire, predominantly controlled by Western banks, truly lost control of the situation. Their grip seems to only tend toward tighter throughout all the history we've covered and unto today. Think about it. Chinese tech arguably surpasses US tech, but their labor markets are paying 1/6 of what the US labor markets are. How can their tech be on par with the US tech when their labor markets are 1/6 as affluent, at least for factory workers? But I'm pretty sure that's a good indicator for the rest of the Chinese labor market. Meanwhile, there's a currency that reigns completely supreme over the globe. How else does that happen? Said currency must be in control of the globe. We know China isn't emerging as a superpower on the merit of its economic system, which is still oppressive despite the loosening restrictions. So it seems the central banking empire is willing to sacrifice at least some of the dollar's long held global dominance in order to build up the military industrial complex in China. Perhaps this has been part of the plan all along. The premise of compounding interest and the corroborating pattern and evidence shown here make me think this whole situation is tightly controlled and therefore likely planned well into the future as well. Sure makes me wonder about the central banking empire's intentions. So we know that the central banking empire that dominates the First World West built up to Eastern superpowers. My guess is these bankers know exactly what they're doing. Just look at the patterns involving the various conflicts in the various nations outlined previously. And now that these central bankers have built up communist or otherwise status regimes in the East, which now rival the Western First World's power, these Eastern superpowers sure seem to be on a collision course with the Western powers. Another important aspect of these world wars coming to fruition is that both world wars followed very poor economic conditions, especially for the lower and middle class, and in both instances, such poor economic conditions lasted close to a decade before the outbreak of the World War. World War II, especially with the Great Depression, but the time period from 1907 to 1914 was no picnic for the majority of the European population either. For the bottom 80% of income earners in most European nations, for the 7 years leading into World War I, they saw a decrease in GDP per capita. 80% is about the percentage of the European working male population that fought in World War I, and the population of European countries were showing signs of increasing malnutrition over the same time period. In 1907, prior to the recession, the US and Europe experienced a significant shortage in the money supply, spurring the bad recession. And who's in charge of the money supply again? Well, at least in Europe, the central banks. At the time, in the US, it was the big banks. But in both cases, it was just tax demand users. Without going into details, I'll just say that the 1929 crash that spurred the Great Depression was also caused by a massive and deliberate contraction in the money supply. People who lived through the Great Depression and World War II have mostly said that the Great Depression was harder than World War II. So why the pattern of abysmal economic conditions prior to world wars? It is the central banking empire's advantage to get the people's willingness and support for the war. And who's more willing to go to war over resources than people who have been hungry and desperate for quite some time? Especially when the propaganda tells you over and over again, while you're so hungry that you can't stop thinking about food, that it is the enemy nation's fault. Moreover, the prospect of regular meals comes with a kill-or-be-killed scenario of such a war. To get the amount of participation required for a war as massive as a world war, the central banking empire needs to make a large percent of the people hungry and desperate enough to send them into a kill-or-be-killed situation. And if you watched my first two videos, the aforementioned documentary, and why I think the everything bubble will pop on Trump, or even just the latter of the two videos, you know I think we're close to seeing financial market crashes that are the magnitude of the 1929 crash start on Trump's watch. I think the crash will lead to a truly Great Depression. I've got a part 2 to the Trump bubble pop video on the way that makes the argument for a Great Depression right around the corner even more convincing. And it might seem like we're never going to see World War III now. But after the money dries up and people and mega corporations and banks and farms start defaulting, and the people are hungry and desperate, and the monetary empire is spewing nationalist propaganda to hungry people, and playing card after card to foment war, you think it might be possible then? And remember, the global decision makers are incentivized to let the economy collapse and then manifest and fuel giant wars. So if indeed World War III is where we're going, then how will it go? So I guess before we get further into the specifics, let's address the first thing that comes to many minds when discussing World War III. Will it go nuclear? I'm personally not sure it will. If the central banking empire's control over all the governments of the world is as complete as I think, then even the most rogue-seeming politician and government officials are really just actors or puppets on behalf of the monetary empire. For example, even Vladimir Putin's ascendance to power would not have happened had it not been for 3 Russian oligarch bankers who were deeply tied to Western banks, who were in turn deeply tied to the Federal Reserve. Originally, 7 Russian oligarch bankers funded the re-election of Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. These 7 bankers controlled over 50% of Russia's GDP and dominated Russian media. By controlling Yeltsin and his cabinet financially, they were able to implement policies that engineered the monetary and economic collapse of Russia. 3 of the 7 bankers, Vladimir Potanin, Petr Avin, and Mikhail Friedman, had much deeper ties to the Western banks behind the Federal Reserve than the other 4 Russian banking oligarchs. After Yeltsin's re-election, Potanin was named the Deputy Prime Minister of Economic Affairs. At this position, Potanin was tasked with executing the Loans for Shares scheme. In order to privatize the Russian economy, the scheme transferred strategic state assets to insiders at below market prices. This was done for pennies on the ruble. This deepened Russia's fiscal debt by failing to generate real revenue, caused asset stripping, capital flight, and ruble instability. This further added to the 40% GDP crash that happened in Russia from 1991 to 1998. One of the policies the 7 bankers were able to get implemented was to get state funds deposited at their banks, much of which they used to buy short-term Russian bonds, which funded the Russian government, who redeposited the funds at the oligarchs' banks, and on, creating a virtually infinite ruble multiplier loop that Russia's central bank did not try to combat, leading to terrible hyperinflation of the Russian ruble. The ensuing economic collapse in Russia paved the way for Putin. Yeltsin, who was controlled by the 7 banker oligarch in Russia, had selected Putin as his predecessor. This was before the other 4 Russian banking oligarchs, who had less significant connections, turned on Putin. Potanin, Avin, and Friedman's wealth grew rapidly under Putin. And until 2022, JP Morgan, Citi, and Goldman Sachs, who happened to be the top 3 stockholders at the New York Federal Reserve, saw expanding influence and market share within mainland Russia, especially corporate finance, and gained a privileged position on dollar-denominated transactions in Russia, i.e. foreign exchange, repatriations, dollar clearing systems, and debt issuance and capital markets in USD, etc. Russia needed these banks to engage in global trade dominated by the world reserve dollar. After 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, These three banks began shutting down business in mainland Russia due to the Western sanctions against Russia. And at first glance, it seems like this would have been a loss for the US banks behind the Fed. But these banks actually dominated the facilitation of the exit trade from the ruble to the dollar and made markets for ruble speculation, including forward contracts and other derivatives in the Middle East and Asia. And as for the exit trade, policy implementations in Russia caused a loss of demand for the dollar in Russia, making dollars cheap in Russia. At the same time, Western firms were incentivized or even ordered to exit Russia due to Western sanctions. JP Morgan, Citi, and Goldman Sachs were able to access dollars from banks in Armenia and Kazakhstan, who in turn had access to the onshore dollar market within Russia. So the three banks were able to buy these cheap dollars and mark them up to the Western firms that were exiting Russia and the ruble, making 2022 the best year ever for these three banks in regards to their Russian business. The IMF, in order to stabilize the Russian move to privatization, provided a loan that Russia defaulted on. The funds from the IMF were funneled through corrupt banking networks and wound up in the hands of Potanin, Avin, and Friedman. These three were also ideally positioned to capitalize on the loans for shares program relative to the rest of the seven bankers before the scheme was established. Avin's and Friedman's ideal positioning in the loan for share scheme was largely due to the bank they owned, Alpha Bank, being tied to JP Morgan, Citi, Goldman Sachs, and Deutsche, who were all stockholders and primary dealers at the New York Federal Reserve and have long-running embeddedness with the central banking empire. Potanin, after being assigned deputy prime minister, managed the IMF loan, where he made sure the IMF funds flowed through his bank, Unexim Bank, where he was able to use the IMF funds to capitalize on the loans for share scheme he managed, and most likely helped come up with and implement by being one of the seven oligarchs behind Yeltsin and his cabinet. I'm sure the IMF had no idea this would happen. More on the IMF later. Potanin, Avin, and Friedman all remain powerful figures in Russia. So even the most rogue-seeming politicians seem to have been placed where they were by the central banking empire. As for Trump, I don't see need to go into too much detail. We see here that in 1990, when the Taj Mahal needed bailed out, Wilbur Ross, while with Rothschild Inc., say they bailed him out because of his showman quality. Wilbur Ross would go on to be Trump's Secretary of Commerce. And Trump's ties to Roy Cohn and Jeffrey Epstein sure make it seem like he's deeply compromised. But we're not going down this rabbit hole today. And while we're on the topic of the Rothschilds, I want to briefly circle back around to their situation in China. It's worth noting that Rothschild & Co. was one of the first Western banks to reestablish relations in China after the CCP Revolution. They had already reestablished in China by 1953. It's also worth noting that their family connection in China goes back to the 1830s when they established a gold and silver trading business in Shanghai. The Rothschild precious metal operation in China expanded greatly after the Opium Wars. Sorry for the Rothschild side tangent. So beyond just the theoretical control I presume the central banking empire to have, these kinds of details further my reasoning as to why I think even actors like Putin will follow a script for World War III. Not only has the monetary empire had the globe covered for a long time, but every nation's debt problem has been a growing problem for a long time. And look how globally coordinated the events in 2020 were. For a global psyop that big, who must have been the decision makers behind it? My documentary expands a little more on the financial aspect revolving around 2020. Now, at least theoretically, the control of the monetary empire over nations, governments, and their militaries should be more complete now than in World War II because of the compounding interest of the entire money supply. So if the monetary empire would rather not utilize nukes in World War III, then it likely won't happen. And I'm thinking the monetary empire is at least somewhat disincentivized from using nukes altogether for reasons I'm guessing you can imagine. But that's not to say I'm sure World War III won't go nuclear. I just think this line of reasoning is enough to keep our World War III projection from stopping at the assumption that World War III will nuke civilization off of the planet. I believe World War III will pose itself as a war between nations, as did the first two world wars, but actually be orchestrated by the monetary empire against the global population and its remaining freedoms, just as the first two world wars were. But my guess is government officials are mostly carefully vetted before being put in a position of power by the global decision makers. In other words, I think Russia, Putin, Xi, and China are all playing along and down with the monetary empire's plans, even if they appear overtly self or nationally interested. Remember, Putin was a spy, a highly skilled liar and actor. But tension has been built among populations of different countries in a way that could easily continue a progression toward World War III, especially if they drag the population through a depression, which all financial indicators are pointing towards starting soon. I'm just glad to know that we still have a lot of freedom here, where I live in the US, and some of the best people I know in the military respect the people and freedom they aim to defend more than they respect those of their superiors whom lick boots or whom are otherwise compromised. So now let's assume there will be no nukes so we can simulate other projections. First of all, I think World War III is as good of a time as any to go full-scale universal basic income, or UBI, if UBI is to become a thing. This would apply to any country involved in World War III, but maybe not every country. People who are aware of the inevitable financial collapse that I'm saying is going to happen before World War III seem to think that it will coincide with hyperinflation of the dollar, Venezuela style. 1929 tells a story of deflation, however. The debt created by compounding interest continually outgrows the money supply until it overwhelms and swallows the money supply and wipes out the money multiplier in a cascade of defaults, which reduces the money supply, which causes deflation. And it also leaves a bunch of collateral for the central banksters to collect. This is all part of the plan we've been outlining. And the same mechanisms that caused the 1929 crash are still at work today. Many will lose their homes and their livelihood. That could be a great time for UBI programs to start to be introduced. However, the banksters in control won't want the hyperinflation without something like a war to blame it on, and they will want the collateral that comes from a deflationary meltdown. They'll wait for the unpayable debt portion of the economy to shrink in a cascade of defaults before they reintroduce extreme inflationary pressure, such as what a full-blown UBI would cause. Not financial advice. Once the war starts, soldiers and their families can get the UBI. What an excellent excuse to progress the implementation of a UBI, likely distributed in the form of a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, giving the monetary empire more ability to track and trace your spending. This could give the monetary empire direct control over how you spend your own money, and even give them another lever with which to control that inflation. Most likely, these CBDCs would be distributed by the government, who will have to ramp up their borrowing from the central banks. I fully expect government debt to exponentiate. Perhaps these CBDCs could be facilitated by privately issued cryptos. We've already seen the biggest central banks in the world, including the Federal Reserve and the IMF, work with certain crypto companies in various capacities. But I'm not here to speculate on investment opportunities, so I don't want to dive into that, at least right now, and that was not financial advice. It is just a potentially nice fit into the expected outcomes of World War III, which includes further consolidation of purchasing power into fewer, many of the same, private hands, and an expansion of government and monetary control. Now let's take a closer look at the global conflict and the global outcomes. Looking at the way the past two world wars went, we see that the world's fastest growing superpower mostly stays out of the conflict until both sides are war-torn and weary. That's when the becoming superpower shows up to the fight fresh and ready to go and closes out the war. This would indicate a Chinese victory, as they are the becoming superpower, something like NATO at war with Russia and probably plenty of conflict elsewhere for a few years, while China mostly stays out of it, seems likely. Then, after the war wears down the nations in conflict, China comes in fresh, gains the upper hand, and triumphs. Notice how currently Russia appears to be the boogeyman, while China is largely ignored, despite being the bigger threat, at least to the Western nations and Western governments. So the monetary empire appears to be sticking to their playbook. And in a way, Chinese victory makes sense. Notice how, on a global scale, there's an obvious trajectory of growing government in relation to the economy, a clear progression towards statism around the globe, generally speaking. Government spending as a percent of GDP has had a strong tendency to increase in most nations for a very long time now, especially freer nations like America. It seems as if the decision makers like the government to grow for reasons already discussed. And China's national model involves a very big government. Moreover, specific government encroachments made in China, such as the social credit score and extreme surveillance, seems to fit the more recent steps taken by the tiptoeing totalitarians. In this way, it seems like the global decision makers have envisioned China's government as the optimal model of government to proliferate globally out of a world war. Furthermore, many anecdotes, for whatever they're worth, hint at China's technological supremacy. So all of this aligns with a decisive Chinese victory. However, this also presents some contradictions to what we've already laid out here. First of all, if China wins, for all intents and purposes, so does the renminbi. The dollar loses. But China's central bank is public. It's state owned. This breaks a pattern we've seen of consolidating the global purchasing power into private hands. Moreover, the ruling monetary class, while apparently not the same exact banks and families throughout time, always seem to remain a tight knit group with changes to such group only happening slowly over time. And as far as we can find, they've predominantly been Anglo Saxons. Although it's worth noting, many foreign banks, even Chinese banks, hold New York Fed stock now. A dramatic shift in the global purchasing power from predominantly private Anglo Saxons to predominantly public Chinese would indicate that the people running the monetary monopoly funded their own demise intentionally or somehow lost control despite compounding interest and its accompanied pattern of consolidation of power globally. Moreover, despite the anecdotes, for China to actually have technological supremacy in a way that also grants the Chinese military supremacy over the US, which in turn is a population that is much more enabled and incentivized by freer economic policy and potential rewards that Americans can afford via the purchasing power Americans can earn with relative ease because of the dollar supremacy, to come up with ingenious technological advancements than the Chinese population is, would seemingly require great coordination from many Western powers. Freer economies are always more inventive and innovative. For doldrum communist China, even with all their STEM education, to out-pioneer the relatively lively U.S. technological market would require coordinated effort from the top Western tech companies and or companies related to defense. Now, the banksters probably know virtually all tech secrets and their primary applications because they are the funding behind it all. They dominate the private and public sector with unlimited capital they can print and leverage they can employ through lending all of the money with interest. So, seemingly, the monetary empire could give whatever they want to China. But what incentive does the private monetary empire have to give the CCP and its renminbi a chance to topple the Federal Reserve's dollar? So, what I expect to come from World War III is a further consolidation of global purchasing power into private central bankers' hands, many of which are the same private hands as before. And I also expect to see growing governance, especially global governance, just like the first two world wars, along with the proliferation of the becoming superpower, which is China, and their state's model. But if China wins, seemingly the purchasing power won't consolidate into fewer of the same private hands, and if the US wins, China's model seemingly won't have much opportunity to proliferate, and the whole Russian NATO setup, orchestrated by the monetary empire, no longer makes much sense. Perhaps during the conflict, As countries struggle financially, the IMF could come into play. Currently, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, issues what they call an International Reserve Asset, which is known as Special Drawing Rights, or SDR. SDRs are a reserve asset basically just central banks can hold, and occasionally multilateral development banks are allowed to hold. These SDRs give its holders access to the 5 currencies that are in the SDR basket. These 5 currencies in the SDR basket are the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the British pound sterling. An important note, the IMF has 190 member countries who pay a subscription fee or quota to join, and in return are given an SDR account balance at the IMF. These member countries pay in their own currency. However, these SDRs are only good in exchange for the 5 SDR basket currencies discussed earlier. So the IMF is essentially increasing the available money supply of non SDR basket currencies and increasing the demand of the basket currencies. This creates purchasing power in the 5 basket currencies at the expense of the other currencies' purchasing power. But the major central banks, like the Fed, the People's Bank of China, and the European Central Bank, have essentially decided to use the IMF as their currency broker, so not going through the IMF and its SDR hurts any non member country's ability to engage in global trade, because those 5 basket currencies are widely accepted around the globe, whereas the other currencies are not. And the IMF further ingrains those 5 currencies' dominance. Also note, the IMF SDR issuance is dependent on the reserves they hold of the member countries' currencies. And remember, the IMF provides loans to struggling countries. So the IMF's issuing power is limited, and they can become insolvent. Now, the BIS uses SDRs as their primary currency. Over the years, the BIS has accumulated an SDR cash position of about 49 billion SDRs. This is all basically from interest income and spreads earned by doing typical banking business with basically just central banks. This 49 billion SDR position is the 3rd biggest in the world behind China and the US and worth about 70 billion US dollars. The BIS has never paid a quota to the IMF like the member countries have to for their SDRs. The BIS balance sheet has a total of 431 billion SDRs and is mostly comprised of things like SDR denominated government bonds. The stockholders of the BIS receive dividend payments. These stockholders include the Federal Reserve and the People's Bank of China. In the past, the BIS has made loans to the IMF. So I see something like this as a potential outcome to World War III. The BRICS nations create their own reserve asset, a project spearheaded by China, and this new BRICS reserve asset competes with SDR's market share. Meanwhile, war-torn countries who needed loans from the IMF struggle to pay the IMF back, or the struggling country's currency is hyperinflating, making their debt payments worthless. The IMF becomes destabilized, and the member countries that are dependent on the IMF are in complete crisis, if not already occupied by the enemy. As a result, the SDR value starts to erode, bringing the IMF to the brink of insolvency. Meanwhile, China, after joining the fight late, appears too strong to defeat. Concessions are then made to China. As far as territory goes, I don't have enough awareness to add value. But inside the UN, China's influence grows dramatically. The UN, in turn, starts to spearhead the implementation of the social credit score into many smaller countries, along with the extreme surveillance that accompanies it, and other statist policies, especially that of which stem from China, at least for starters, pushing these oppressive policies into freer, or at least what were freer, countries. And even if the US and NATO alliance gets the upper hand, the domestic governments of those countries will still likely push a statist agenda at every opportunity World War III presents, still giving a lot of room for the totalitarians to start walking instead of tiptoeing. If China wins, it's more like a jog or full-on sprint. As for the IMF, the BIS steps in to buy them out. But in doing so, the BIS also decides to make another share offering, a strategic recapitalization for the buyout of the IMF. This grants the BIS rights to issue SDRs. But the BIS decides that the SDR is no longer viable, and the BIS starts issuing a new reserve asset. But the BIS will honor those old SDR obligations with their new reserve asset and restructure the debt to the countries who defaulted to the IMF and their new reserve asset, shifting the power from the national central banks and their currencies to the Bank of International Settlements and its reserve asset. This new BIS reserve asset would likely be backed by a lot of the same currencies as the SDR, but maybe throw in commodities, as we've been hearing them talk about, as a way for them to gain more control over those commodities, just like when they were compounding interest into the gold supply. And who knows, maybe they could even throw some carbon credits in there. This new reserve asset would likely heavily utilize blockchain technology. The new capital that floods into the BIS's second offering largely comes from Western banks like JP Morgan, Deutsche, and Citi, but also central banks. The UN, who is already struggling financially, not in our hypothetical here, but in current reality, would really be hurting in our hypothetical. But the powers that be convince the global population that the UN needs to expand to ensure peace moving forward and global stability. The ideal opportunity to put the UN in hock to the BIS. And now the quickly expanding global government creates a ton of demand for this new BIS reserve asset. Meanwhile, the dollar's market share has already been reduced greatly, and China's ascendancy causes renminbi gains relative to the dollar. Moreover, the BRICS reserve asset also increased renminbi demand, similar to the way the IMF increased the demand for the 5 currencies in its SDR basket. Perhaps the renminbi won't have flipped the dollar yet, but perhaps it's getting close. The market share is near neck and neck. The dollar is essentially no longer the world reserve currency. A void has been created. Also, a huge opportunity for the new BIS reserve asset to sprawl. This could be enough to eventually consolidate the global concentration of purchasing power into the new BIS reserve asset without the majority of the banksters having funded their own demise, which is not something we should expect. A continuation of the same monetary empire, whom I believe has every intention of fueling and winning World War III. To further solidify this expected outcome of retained power by most of the same top banksters, maybe the People's Bank of China also has a strategic recapitalization and invites international financial institutions, while the Chinese government retains 51% ownership. They brand it as a global stability partnership because they need to make sure that they have funds necessary to play their part in rebuilding globally after World War III. They brand it as a global stability partnership to the global population, and to the Chinese population, they sell it as needing to make sure that they have the funds necessary to play their part in rebuilding globally after World War III. Much of the old Western money power gobbles up these shares. Of course, this further strengthens the renminbi and weakens the dollar, as institutions like JP Morgan sell dollars for renminbis to buy stock in the People's Bank of China. The monetary empire's plan might continue with something like this: that in the midst of the restructuring after World War III, the BIS takes this opportunity to restructure debt and supposedly stabilize trade. So they push for their new reserve asset to be treated like a world reserve currency. And of course, just as always, this new currency's dominance will be enforced low-key by the world's most powerful militaries. Who knows, maybe even Russia gets in there. But China and the US will most certainly back it, at least in this hypothetical. Countries start to rely on it heavily for international trade settlements instead of any national currency. Perhaps countries most in need start accepting it as an option for tax payments, legal tender, or both, causing it to be used domestically in countries around the globe as well. I'll let you continue the simulations from there in your own head, but this scenario would fit the pattern. The concentration of purchasing power globally would consolidate into fewer private hands. and into a fully international corporation. The governments would be placed under the weight of crushing debt as a result of the war, creating dependency on the BIS, whom the countries will need to recycle their old debt with new debt so they can stay solvent, further embedding them into the perpetual debt cycle to central banks. The governmental power would be consolidated globally as well at the UN, and the Chinese state model of control would have the opportunity to proliferate. Now, I'm not saying I think it's going to go exactly like this. I just think something like this is the general idea of what the monetary empire has planned for World War III. And who knows, this could even set the stage nicely for World War IV. So, to really drive home the understanding of where freedom comes from, such as what we prize as American freedom, I want to show you one more clip from my documentary. It appears that at least some of the men we call founding fathers had ties to the Bank of England even during the American Revolution. For example, George Washington's stock in the Bank of England and his subsequent failure to veto the first central bank of the United States. These same men were involved in the federal ratification of the United States Constitution, which was only supposed to be amendments to the Articles of Confederation. The federal ratification was also arguably illegal at the time. The Constitution then enabled these same men to set up a central bank in the United States, just like that of the Bank of England, thereby expanding the central banking empire. It's important to remember that the Bank of England would have been compounding interest in the English economy, into the English government, into the English monarch for nearly a century at this point in time. So England would have probably been controlled by the central bank, not the monarch. The United States federal government racked up about $75 million in debt during the Revolutionary War. Obviously, $75 million was a lot more back then than it is now. This debt was known to at least have played a part in the calling for a constitutional convention. It's well known that some of the stockholders of the first two central banks of the United States were from foreign countries, although the percent of those stockholders that were from foreign countries is in dispute. So let me ask you a question that you don't have to answer yet. From a bird's eye view, does the American Revolution appear to have been about gaining independence from a monarch or about a central bank cornering a monetary market? But the root of all this goes deeper than the central banks. So while I don't expect the details of what I've speculated on here to be precise, I do expect my speculations to fit the general idea of what to expect in World War III, especially if the monetary empire wins again. But we're still here, and we're not all enslaved as the monetary empire would seemingly like, and the monetary empire is still acting covertly. This tells me they view us as a threat. This makes me think we can still win. So I'm going to ask you what I frequently ask myself. So my question is, when the enemy comes knocking and tries to frame something or someone else as the enemy, will you know who the real enemy is, and will you have the courage to act in accordance with such knowledge? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.